In JJK Chapter 259, Sukuna took his 9th known binding vow in the story. Yes, he has used 9 binding vows as far as we know, and there's very likely more than just that throughout all of JJK, and with him creating yet another binding vow after just creating one in the previous chapter, it's led a lot of people to become very frustrated with Sukuna basically abusing the concept of binding vows within the story, and this isn't something new. People were frustrated with this for quite a while, and especially during Chapter 258, but with this chapter where he just used it yet again, it has become a hot topic on if binding vows are just ruining JJK, with some people arguing that it's become a massive problem in JJK, but others arguing that it's not. And that's pretty much what I want to talk about today. Are binding vows actually a problem? Is Sukuna really abusing it too much? And is it even fair in the story that he's doing it this much? And by the end of this video, I do hope I've given you a satisfying answer. So hey, be sure to leave a like, helps out a lot, thank you. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for a ton of consistent and quality JJK content just like this. Less than 10% of people who watch my videos are subscribed. So if you love JJK, I promise you won't regret subscribing. And of course, thank you to the special grade members of the channel. Alright, let's get right into this. So first things first, a binding vow is just simply a contract that you can make either with yourself or with someone where you either sacrifice something or you offer something in exchange for something else. And of course, if you break these binding vows, apparently something very horrible will happen to you, to the point that even characters such as Sukuna and Kenjaku are just too afraid to break binding vows. I mean, if Sukuna right here is abiding to the many binding vows he's made, it just simply means that no matter how strong you are, you can't go against them. Pretty much, it's just a contract from Hunter x Hunter placed into the Jujutsu Kaisen world. And there's a lot of examples of binding vows. For example, the most common binding vow used by a plethora of sorcerers and even cursed spirits is the revealing of one's hand binding vow. Pretty much all it means is that in exchange for telling your opponent what your curse technique is or explaining it in that moment, you'll get a temporary boost in your next attack or your output. It's used by many characters and it's very effective where, depending on how you use it, it can lead to a massive blow. Another famous contract is overtime. Naname basically puts himself at around 80 to 90% of his true power all the time, but after a certain time period while he's been working, his cursed energy will skyrocket to 110 to 120% of his normal cursed energy output. Some other famous examples of using a binding vow of yourself is Hakari when he sacrificed his left arm so the rest of him could live. A very clever binding vow by Meme is forcing a crow to commit suicide, the trade-off being that a weak bird becomes insanely powerful, so much so that no one other than Gojo and Sukuna have survived a bird strike. And some examples of using a binding vow of other people, so a mutual binding vow, is Itadori and Sukuna when they made a binding vow that Yuji would forget what happened but Sukuna would get control for 1 minute, Mekamaru with Mahito and Kenjaku, Oi with Meme, Kenjaku with all the sorcerers that he made contracts with, Yuta with the higher-ups where he was forced to kill Yuji, but of course he made a very clever loophole in that binding vow where he killed him, fulfilling the binding vow, but of course he healed him and resurrected him in that moment, bringing him back to life, and in exchange they told him where Yuji was. And now I will list off the 9 known binding vows we know of Sukuna. The first is between him and Kenjaku, where we don't know the exact details, but I'm just gonna guess that in exchange for him turning Sukuna into a cursed object, Sukuna would have to partake in the ritual. I'm guessing it's that because Kenjaku told Sukuna that you can't fight Gojo until you fulfill the conditions of our binding vow, and later on we find out that Sukuna took a ritual to take over the merger if Kenjaku is defeated, which he did over the time skip, so it's probably that. The second binding vow being between him and Itadori. The third binding vow is with his domain, which he has many with his domain, where he increases the range in exchange for creating an escape option. The fourth binding vow is the world ending slash, where he permanently nerfed how he can use the world ending slash in exchange for firing it off with only one hand against Gojo. The fifth one is the one that he made with Jogo, where he said if he could just land a hit on him within 1 minute, he'll listen to what the cursed spirits have to say and just obey them. The sixth is the one he made of Yorozu, where he said that if Yorozu could defeat or kill him, she can do whatever he wants with him. The seventh binding vow, which with how it's worded is implied to be many binding vows, so not just one, but we'll just include it under one umbrella for now, is the one that he made recently in chapter 258 to create his domain expansion, the incomplete one. The eighth binding vow is that outside of his domain, divine flames or furnace cannot be used on multiple targets, very likely a binding vow that he made way back in the Heian era. And of course his ninth binding vow that he just made recently, the flames within the furnace lack both speed and range. To amend this, Sukuna undertook a binding vow, basically giving it a massive range and also huge speed. And I can't lie, that's pretty wild. He has made 9 known binding vows, with the one in chapter 258 likely being multiple binding vows, not even including the many other binding vows that he's probably made during the Heian era or in times we didn't even see him. And of course there's a lot of differing thoughts on this, with some not minding it all and some being very against it, with many people being in the middle, which is probably where I would land. And I asked my channel members as well for their thoughts on this, with Chief Keef saying, I don't see it as much of a big deal as everyone else is making it out to be. It's a tool to push the story along and make cool stuff happen, which is where I'm seeing a lot of specifically Sukuna fans lie, where they're saying of course it's okay, I mean it's a part of the story, and of course it puts our main characters in positions that are very tough because Sukuna's abusing them, so even when he shouldn't be able to do certain things such as opening his domain, we get to see that anyway, or his flames wouldn't be nearly as awesome in that double page spread, we would have never gone there if we didn't have binding vows. But one of the most common complaints that I hear about binding vows, which is what a majority of my channel members said and is also something that are being said by a lot of other people, people, and it's something that I also agree with, it's the fact that binding vows are so easy to make that you can make them in an instant, as Hakari did, probably within less than a second, yet the main cast are not abusing them. They are just not using them at all. But Sukuna is just absolutely going crazy with it, though of course you can argue it makes sense that Sukuna is abusing them because Sukuna is the pinnacle of Jujutsu. He's a genius when it comes to fighting. I agree with that, but I just think that the main cast aren't that stupid, they aren't that dumb, especially when you're going into a life and death battle. Well, let's be honest, the odds against Sukuna are incredibly slim and you're likely going to die, so if you're gonna die anyway, you may as well make binding vows, even sacrificing your life or how strong you're gonna be in the future just to beat this guy. I mean, it's something I wish Gojo would have done more. Gojo knew that he wasn't pushing Sukuna to use everything that he had. He knew that Sukuna had a lot hidden. I just wonder why he wasn't using more binding vows during his fight with Sukuna if he did know that it's a pretty much life and death battle, and if that he loses, not only will he die, but many characters after him who have to jump Sukuna once he dies will very likely die. And right here we have two comments from members. Yokai Gotha says the other cast should utilize them, they seem easy to do. They are way stronger than Miwa, their binding vows would be more effective. The Miwa part is highlighted in Loud Gaming's comment as well. Why is it the only one who knows how to use them effectively is Sukuna? Miwa's binding vow was very weak, and somehow Hakari was able to heal an army sacrificed due to a binding vow. With the Hakari sacrificing his arm for a binding vow, I don't think he healed it with a binding vow. I think it's that Yuta or Shoko were the ones to heal Hakari's hand. It's very likely that Hakari was aware that he was compatible with either Yuta or Shoko, or maybe even both, for them to heal him, because we know that with reverse curse technique, and specifically in regards to healing others, depending on how compatible you are, it does change how well and effectively you can heal them. So again, Hakari may have already known that Shoko would have been able to heal his hand because it's something they discovered in the past, and that's why he was confident he would have been able to heal his hand, whereas of course both Shoko and Yuta weren't able to heal Hana's missing arm because they just weren't compatible with her. And something that both Loud Gaming and Yokai said is that Miwa's binding vow was very weak, but the other characters' binding vows would be much more effective. The reason this is, and this is just how I interpret it, is the more you have to offer, the stronger the binding vow will be. So for example, if you're someone like Miwa, and let's just keep it real, I love Miwa, she's awesome, but her potential isn't that high. I mean, let's just say she trained for 20-30 years and she reached her peak at age 40, she's at the absolute peak of where she would normally be, or age 30. Let's say her peak is around Naname, which is still saying a lot because she has no curse technique, so it's grade 1. Let's just say her peak is very high grade 1. If Miwa is sacrificing her ever using a katana again in exchange for creating a super strong swing, it's very likely that that one swing was at the absolute peak that she would ever reach in exchange again for her never using it again, which is why Kenjaku was able to easily stop it. Yes, it's still a very powerful swing, but Kenjaku is a special grade sorcerer who can manhandle grade 1s with his bare hands like it's a joke. It reminds me of Gon from Hunter x Hunter, where he made a contract with himself to offer everything away in exchange for giving him all the power he could have ever had. Gon is a 1 out of a million, or I think it was 1 out of 10 million, something crazy, prodigy when it comes to Nen. The level he's at his age is simply phenomenal. He truly is gifted beyond gifted. So that's why when he offered everything, it made him as strong as the king, as strong as Meruem, and he absolutely destroyed Pito, who is one of the strongest characters, just period, in the verse. Whereas I assure you, if you had someone else, let's say Leorio, and I really love Leorio, so not to be too mean to him, but if he made that contract with himself, he wouldn't be nearly as strong as Gon. And that's why Miwa is as weak. So for example, if you had someone like Yuji make that exact same binding vow that Miwa made, because we know that Yuji has the same potential as Sukuna, and his potential likely goes above even Sukuna's given the editor's own words, and the fact that he has another curse technique on top of that, and he also has a new aged evolved version of Sukuna's own curse technique. So let's say you gave Yuji 20-30 years to train as hard as he can of his curse technique, and he reaches the pinnacle of his strength. If Yuji were to make one punch where he sacrifices never punching again, but that one punch is as strong as everything he has to offer, that punch is going to hit like an absolute truck. I mean, it would very likely kill anybody in the verse if it lands. Contrary to Miwa's swing, because Yuji has a lot of potential. Even though it's the same binding vow as Miwa, he has a lot more to offer because his potential is higher, and he's offering that greater potential in exchange for greater power. And two of the channel members also comment on this. The Divine Dai says we should see someone on the good side, use one during the fight, and eventually learn more of what Sukuna has sacrificed. With Denji saying just let other people make binding vow, like if they did, they would have won by now. I'ma give Sukuna credit where it's due, but what does bro have left to sacrifice? The Choso crying emojis. Which again is something I agree with, especially with Yuji, who is putting his very life on the line. I mean, he should be sacrificing everything to beat Sukuna. He should have made a binding vow before he went in to fight Sukuna to possibly give his very life away so that after this fight is done, he only has a couple days or a year left to live, or he would even die after after this fight of Sukuna is done in exchange for giving him his absolute peak and maximum potential. Because if the chances of you dying against Sukuna are 99% anyway, you may as well make this binding vow and just assure victory even if you're going to die. Which is pretty funny because what I'm saying is going against what Gojo said when he was training Megami, and is the exact opposite of what he's trying to teach him, where he's trying to tell Megami, stop spamming Maharaga, man. But I do think in this instance, when you're fighting Sukuna and the odds of you dying are 99.9%, it is something that you should go for. And obviously it depends on the character. A lot of these characters don't want to die, but at least for Yuji, this is very well within character. And we could have seen other binding vows, such as Higuruma offering something in exchange for making himself stronger. I mean, Yuji should just be spamming them like an absolute merchant, because like I was saying, you're likely going to die anyway. Just put as many binding vows as you can to nerf yourself. So let's say after the fight, Yuji would forever be very weak and you'd have a ton of conditions on him for the rest of his life, but hey, you've beaten Sukuna, that's all that matters, right? Like Mr. 60 says, Sukuna regained the domain but made binding vows to make it work without it being weaker than normal shrine. If the others used binding vows more than they do, people wouldn't have as much as a problem with it, and maybe Todo's new curse technique is a binding vow, because GEGE did say that the original curse technique has died, which is something that Todo did say. He said his curse technique's dead, but now he's saying I can feel the heartbeat of Boogie Woogie. And something I personally want to say is binding vows are awesome. I think it's a awesome concept. He got it straight from Hunter x Hunter. The concept itself of contracts, binding vows is amazing. I have no issues with that. And even Sukuna using binding vows, I don't have a problem with that. Him using a binding vow to fire off the world ending slash, I think that made sense. He sacrificed something that permanently nerfed his world ending slash forever. I mean, if he didn't make that binding vow, Sukuna would be able to easily, and I truly mean very easily, fire off world ending slashes like it's an absolute joke. So it did greatly nerf him. And of course, the binding vow that he made, likely in the Heian era, where outside of his domain, Furnace cannot be used on multiple opponents. I think that's a massive nerf to his flames, and explains why we haven't seen him use it at all throughout the series. And of course, I do think that there's probably going to be another big drawback to Sukuna increasing the speed and range of his technique in exchange for something which we still don't know, which Sukuna made in the recent chapter. But I do think it's getting a little crazy how he's just simply spamming them again and again. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense, I'm not saying it's something that wasn't established before, but all I'll say is that it's just getting a bit old, seeing him just keep on spamming the same thing over and over. And I mean, if he uses one again next chapter, it's like, okay, this guy's using his 10th binding vow in the series. It makes sense within the story, and also it does go in line of Sukuna being the pinnacle of Jujutsu, so he's just abusing this system. I think I'd truly be okay with it if we just saw the main cast using them more, especially in this life and death battle. And I have my own theory that Choso used a binding vow in the most recent chapter, where I don't care how much blood he's using or how hard he's making it, there is no way Choso making a ball of blood is tanking Sukuna's flames at maximum output that would have even killed Gojo, is sort of what's being implied in this chapter. I think the reason that Choso's defense was so strong is that he gave his very own life to make that ball of blood defense, which of course we see that as soon as the ball was done and the attack was finished, Choso turned into ash and dust and he died. It's not confirmed, but I do believe that it's the only way that it would make sense for Choso's ball of blood to have tanked an attack that instantly one-shot Maharaga and would have done the same to Gojo. But I do hope we get to see more binding vows so Yuji, because he is witnessing Sukuna spam them firsthand, maliciously abusing them. So hopefully Yuji realizes that he should do the same thing, because at this point many others are going to die to Sukuna and the chances of him dying to Sukuna are still high. But what are your thoughts about binding vows in JJK? Let me know in the comments, and of course, if you did enjoy the video, be sure to leave a like here, a ton, thank you. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for a ton of consistent and quality JJK content just like this. Like I said in the intro, less than 10% of people who watch my videos are subscribed, so if you love JJK, I assure you, you won't regret subscribing. And of course, thank you to all the channel members as well, it is always much appreciated. That's all from me guys, have a great day and take care.